All right, guys, welcome back. In the first video, I kind of went over the Bible a little bit, talked about some of the reasons that I think there's some validity to it. Well, I think the whole thing's valid, but at least a jump point or a flash point for you guys. So if you have some questions about the Bible, a place that you could start at to kind of take a look at it for yourself and just see what you think of it. Maybe a different way to look at it, or a way to kind of separate it in your mind from maybe some of the other sources that are out there, or some of the other ancient texts that are out there. Today we'll go ahead, we'll talk about Jesus, why I think that he is who he said he was. And I know people say he didn't say he was the Messiah. He basically did say it. We'll cover Jesus in this one, the historical figure who really was a real historical figure, and we'll go over some, details and information and points about him that help solidify in my mind that he actually is exactly who he said he was. So, first point, C.S. Lewis said, Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance. The one thing that you cannot be is moderately important. And I think that is a pretty wise thing, holds true today. If you guys remember a number of years ago, maybe it was like 15 years ago, there was a movie called Zeitgeist. It was broken down into 3 parts. One of the parts was it covered basically stuff that happened on 9/11. It covered what the banking system was. And then the third point that it covered was the idea, or that Jesus was nothing more than how would you call it? The Jesus myth theory. The idea that Jesus actually didn't exist, that he was really just an allegory. He was really an allegory for the Son, the disciples. There were 12 of them, so Jesus was the center of the cross. The disciples were the other symbols of the zodiac, if you guys remember it. I'll put a link in the description of the video. You can watch kind of the video that I'm talking about. What I do want to cover regarding that is that it's a very, very popular thing for a while. Now, it's been thoroughly discredited at a minimum, by just about everybody, scholars included. There are a number of people that still hold on to it and still make the claim that Jesus was actually nothing more than the Jesus myth. And it's the key reason people claim for why they're atheists or something along that. I have no, I'm not going to bash atheists. There's no reason to. If you are leaning towards atheism, or if you're leaning towards the idea that there's no God, or leaning towards the idea that I don't want to be accountable for any of the things that I do, and I know it's a little bit harsh to say, but the Bible clearly talks about what's the nature of our heart and what our heart wants, and the heart wants what the heart wants, and the heart wants sin, basically. And for people that use the Jesus myth theory as the springboard in order to get them into atheism and say this is the reason, I get, how would I put it? I get how people get there. The Jesus myth theory thing was a difficult thing for me when I first heard it. I couldn't resolve it. And at the time, the internet was still in its infancy. So when somebody presented you with a very, very good or very compelling or convincing argument, without the proper resources, without the proper time and the ability, the determination to look, a lot of times the videos will make up our minds for us or help us make up our mind, which is what we wanted anyways. Getting an opportunity to look at it now from the perspective that I have now and look at it now, there is no credibility to the Jesus myth stuff, at least in my mind, as well as, like I say, the minds of scholars as well. First things foremost, for Zeitgeist got a majority of the information that they got for that video from a woman that went by the name of Asharia S. She argued that pre-Christian religious civilizations understood their mythologies as allegorical, but the Roman Empire destroyed the evidence, ensuring that the mythical nature of Christ's story was hidden. She is an author, a spiritualist, and an astrotheologian. She died in 2015. Her information, her research comes from 2 different sources primarily. Well, actually, let's do it. Let's reverse it. Where the Jesus myth theory basically came up from was 2 specific people. Charles Francois Dupré, he was 1742 to 1809, and Christian Francois de Volnay, and he was 1757 to 1820. These 2 guys knew each other. They basically came up with the Jesus Christ myth theory, the idea that he was nothing more than an allegory for the sun rising and falling at the winter solstice. He was an allegory for the purpose of astrology. He was an allegory for a variety of different things. And they basically kind of concocted this entire thing. Influenced by Christian de Volney was Godfrey Higgins. He was 1772 to 1833. He was a student of the Atlantis religion, or what I like to call the very first religion. We'll definitely get into that. And his title was Chosen Chief Druid. He was part of secret society groups, and he had the title of Chosen Chief Druid. He influenced somebody by the name of Kersey Graves. Kersey Graves was 1813 to 1883, and he was a spiritualist, summoned and talked to the other side, that kind of thing. And his work specifically influenced Sharia S. Now, on the other side of that, Francois Dupree, he influenced, although not a direct link, there were a number of people in between here. A fellow by the name of Edward Carpenter. He was 1844 to 1923. He was a socialist. He was a gay rights activist. He was also involved in the occult, and he ended up also influencing Sharia S. So she got influences from people that were influenced by both sides of the Christ myth theory, if that makes sense. So, and I actually have a diagram here, and I'll show you the diagram so this all makes sense as I kind of go through it. Now, what's important to note is that it's basically a giant full circle. Godfrey Higgins, if you remember, I talked about him, the Atlantis religion guy. He influenced a guy by the name of Gerald Massey. Gerald Massey was 1828 to 1907. He was a spiritualist. He was also held the title of Chosen Chief Druid. And that was the Gossard of the Bards, by the way. That was the secret society that they're part of, and they still exist today, the Gossard of the Bards. I think they're a Scottish group. He influenced Helena Blavatsky. Helena Blavatsky from 1831 to 1891. She's a spiritualist, also a student of the Atlantean religion as well, and also the founder of the Theosophical Society. Now, on the other side of that, the Charles Dupree to Edward Carpenter. Edward Carpenter was friends with Annie Besant, and she is 1847 to 1933, who is also a spiritualist, and her, Helena Blavatsky, and Alice Bailey, who's also a spiritualist. These were the three main key component figures that basically created and pushed the idea of theosophy through the Theosophical Society, Lucifer Publishing, if you're familiar with that kind of stuff. All right, so that's kind of the overall arching thing. The point that I'm trying to make with this is that it sounds like some sort of lost thing, lost knowledge that people had at one time, but only the foolish people believe that Jesus was a real historical figure. We take a look at where it comes from, where the story was created, where it came from, and who the people were involved. You find the occult's fingerprints all over this, okay? Specifically, the Atlantean religion, and I'll get into what that is as we kind of move on. It's a massive part of this story and the history of how things all go, and this will all make sense to you guys too, because I know you know a lot of this stuff as well. All right, I don't think, it took me a long time to put the timeline, to put all the pieces in place. Once the pieces go into place, then there's a wider picture that starts forming and starts making more sense. So moving on, all right? If we take a look at the idea, if Jesus himself was just a mythical figure, and didn't really exist, we wouldn't have as many different subsects or subgroups that would be under, I guess, the Christian umbrella, so to speak, or Western religion umbrella, I think it's probably a better term, that would also acknowledge that Jesus was at least a figure that existed. The Jehovah's Witnesses have their say that spiritual evidence indicates that the name Michael applied to God's son before he left heaven to become Jesus Christ, and also after his return. So the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that the Archangel Michael and Jesus are the same figure. The Mormons, in the book of Moses 4:1-4, Satan was the son of God, therefore Jesus and Satan are brothers. This tenet is a de-gods Jesus and elevates Satan. And we see that through the Mormons, they still look at the idea of Jesus as being a real figure and related within the spiritual realm of things. The Hindus, Jesus is one of the many great quote-unquote holy men. He was a good teacher and probably one of their 330 million avatars that they have. Avatars mean something very specific in the occult. It has, and we'll get into a little bit of that, and I'll explain what an avatar is. My point is, with the Hindus, though, even they recognize the fact that Jesus is an actual figure. Okay, now these systems, these religious systems, identify Jesus differently than what I would argue from a Christian worldview, or I'll put it this way, my worldview. I don't want to go run around and say certain people are Christians or aren't, or only God knows what's in their heart. I don't. But for the purposes of this presentation, that I call the parallel lie, I'm going to break down what Satan's system is, what his lies are, and we'll see them pop up over and over and again throughout history in different forms and different systems, disguising itself over and over again. And my argument is that the only through line through history, of the through line of Christianity through history, is the only one that's unwavering. It doesn't hide itself. It doesn't disguise itself. It's from beginning to end, it is the same. It doesn't need to change, and it doesn't need to change because it's God's system. It's the true system. Okay. If we even take a look at the New Age, Jesus was an enlightened teacher that realized the truth, that he was God, just like we can all realize that we're God as well. So this is other systems, some other systems of who they say Jesus is, and we can see they're a little bit different. So, the Christ myth theory. All right, let's just take a few of these off the top, and I'll just show that there isn't any there when it comes to how they compare Jesus to these ancient gods. And I'll tell you who the ancient gods actually really were as we move along. So Jesus versus Horus. On September 25th, since Horus is a sky god and the sun rises each day, you can say that Horus is born each day in the sense that he was born on December 25th. So they compare Jesus to Horus and say Horus was born on December 25th, also just like Jesus. But the reality is it's an interpretation. It's an allegory. And allegory is going to keep coming up over and over again. It's not that Horus was really born on December 25th, but he's the sky god. He rises each day, so it could be said that he was born on December 25th. It could also be said he was born on November 6th. It could also be said he was born on March 22nd. All right? So this is one of the ways that they present information. Technically, it's true, but it ultimately, a reasonable person wouldn't interpret what they're saying in the way that they actually mean it. One of the other things, Horus's mother's name was also Mary. So this is a way that you know that Horus and Jesus are basically the same. Horus's mother's name was actually Isis. Mer was the title attributed to many Egyptian gods. It means beloved. So Mer Amen, Ra. All references to the god can be found within the historical record. So, Mary, I'm saying Mer. So, Mary Amen, Ra. Okay, so this is just a title that's given, and it's another way that a god's name can be written. So, the idea that Mer or Mary is attributed, it just means beloved. So, when they say Mary, M-E-R-I in English, whereas when we say Mary, Jesus' mom, M-A-R-Y, they're different. They're different meanings, different definitions, different words entirely, but it sounds the same. So, of course, Horus's mother was really named Mary too, just like Jesus. Another thing is that the idea that Jesus walked on water, so did Horus. Horus also walked on water. And here's the explanation. Since the sun shines on the water each day and the water reflects the sun, it can be said that Horus walks on water because the reflection of the sun gleams on the water. So once again, technically true, but it's a play on words. If somebody said to you, Horus walked on water, your mind wouldn't go to the idea that what they really mean is the reflection of the sun dances and reflects on the water itself. Therefore, it's like he's walking on water. You wouldn't interpret it that way, but they can hide what it is that they're saying in allegory, which is a big thing. These are all basically allegories, is a way to look at all this stuff. And that's a big part of the occult. It's a big part of the system, the nature of allegories and how allegories work. And you have to be the adept, so you get studied on it, and then you find out the truth about things through the allegories. And that's all what I'm gonna lay out for you as we move forward. So Jesus versus Mithra. Here are the Mithra claims that were made. He was born of a virgin on December 25th in a cave with shepherds. Here's the actual historical fact. The figure Mithra was actually born out of solid rock, so they're not even related at all. That's all it said about him. He was born out of solid rock, so that's actually an outright fabrication. Mithra was considered to be a great traveling teacher. The actual history in the writings of Mithra, Mithras, There's no indication that he was a teacher at all. He had 12 companions or disciples. That's one of the claims in Zeitgeist. The truth of the Mithra figure is that there are murals that show that Mithra is surrounded by the zodiac. Remember, once again, the zodiac actually represents the 12 disciples in this allegory system within Zeitgeist. So, of course, Mithra and Jesus are the same figure. Mithra promised his followers immortality. There's quite simply no evidence of this within the limited information, the limited teachings of the Mithrist religion that are actually out there. Mithras performed miracles. Mithras was a mythological character. He wasn't actually a real figure. Mythological characters perform great feats. They perform miracles, that kind of thing. So there's nothing unusual about that at all. We would expect to see something like that within an imaginary figure like this. Mithras sacrificed himself for world peace. The only death or dying that was involved with Mithras in the stories of the figure itself was that Mithras actually slayed a threatening bull. He didn't actually die for world peace, but he did kill a bull. He was buried in a tomb, and then after 3 days, he rose again. The Mithras figure never actually died, let alone he never resurrected, because you can't resurrect if you don't die. The claim that was made in Zeitgeist is that he's called the Good Shepherd. He's identified with the lamb and the lion. And the facts of this is that in Babylonian astrology, the sun is within the house of Leo. So I guess you could make that association if you want to, but hardly clinching facts that Jesus and Mithras are actually the same figure. On Sunday was Mithras' sacred day. Evidence does indicate that this is actually borrowed from Christianity. The Mithras claim in Zeitgeist that he celebrated a Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. And then the actual historical facts show that followers of Mithras did not celebrate the Eucharist at all. So this is just to put things into a perspective for you. When you look at a video like that, it can be overwhelming. You're getting bombarded with information, bombarded with stuff. If you get an opportunity to break each thing down, each claim down, you find out that Jesus is remarkably different from, quote, the other gods. So the other gods, they are, quote, lowercase gods, for example. Jesus was a real person that claimed to be the Son of God. Completely different things. The other gods, they are the dying and the rising gods, were closely related within the seasonal cycles, whereas Jesus himself, the death and resurrection of Jesus, is a one-time event. It is not repeated, and it is unrelated to seasonal changes. So once again, also very, very different. For the gods, there's no evidence for the death and the dying and the rising of gods as a vicarious suffering for sins. And the death of Jesus is a suffering act for the atonement of sins. Completely different things entirely. There are over 40 extra biblical historical sources that directly reference Jesus. To put this into a perspective, Julius Caesar, his own accounts, there are only 5 sources for Julius Caesar. The first one is his own accounts of the Gallic War. The speeches that he gave of Cicero. Salutis, I can never pronounce some of this stuff. Salutis' account of the Catiline War. Another dude that I can't even pronounce, I'm not even going to try. His section on Caesar in 12 Caesars, and Plutarch's section on Caesar in Plutarch's Lives. So 3 of the accounts that we actually have for Julius Caesar actually 4 of them are written by other people. There's only 1 account that we actually have that we would attribute to being Julius Caesar himself, and there are only 4 accounts that we can ascribe written by other people that say that he was a real person that actually existed. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, let's start right there. So if it's good enough for Caesar, then simply put, those books of the Bible right there should be enough to prove that it's legitimate that Jesus was a real historical figure if we're going to use the same standard for Julius Caesar. But because it's the Bible, because it's Christianity, because it's true, we can't do that. So that's not good enough. You can't use 4, you have to use more, because those guys could have just written anything. Well, the same could be said for the accounts of Julius Caesar. Socrates, everybody knows who he is. The only source for Socrates are other people's accounts of him. Despite the few sources and heavy contradictions, no one doubts the existence of Socrates. Josephus Flavius, in his work, The Antiquities of number 20, volume 9, quote, "And brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he formed an accusation against them as the breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." Cornelius Tacticus, in his final work, The Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, Tacticus writes, called Christians by the populace, Christos, from whom the name has its origin, writes about Pilate as being, he also writes about Pilate as being the prefect that judged Jesus. So Cornelius Tacticus makes two references specifically to Jesus. There are numerous other references throughout history. Josephus, the Talmud, Thales, Tacticus, Serapone. It's been a while since I've done this. Pliny the Younger, Phlegon of Tralles. There are a number of his respected historical figures that specifically reference Jesus as being a real figure, a real person. There are many scholars that will actually agree with that. There are some scholars that'll disagree with that. But overall, there's enough evidence there to indicate that he really was a very real figure and not an allegory for the sun god. Dr. Bart Ehrman, he is an agnostic. I think I think he goes by the title of agnostic now. Very, very, very respected scholar. Christians use him all the time in order to show, look, see, even this guy who doesn't believe that Jesus, was the Son of God, still says that Jesus actually existed. There's some quotes from him. One could argue as well that Jesus is the most important person in history in the West, looked at from a historical, social, and cultural perspective, quite apart from his religious significance. Another quote, it's fair to say that the mythicists as a group and the individuals who are not taken seriously by the vast majority of scholars in the field of New Testament, early Christianity, ancient history, and theology. He's specifically talking about the Jesus myth theory in this particular quote. So he's saying that these guys, they don't hold any water. Scholars don't even give them any credence at all because it's ridiculous. The idea that Jesus did not exist is a modern notion. It has no ancient precedents. It was made up in the 18th century. One might call it a modern myth and the myth of the mythical Jesus. So Dr. Bart Ehrman, who's, I guess, doesn't really have anything to gain or lose by saying it. He's a scholar, and he's just saying what is. And he's laying out and pointing out that the Jesus myth theory is just a bunch of silly nonsense. And scholars just don't ascribe to it. John 15, 8 through 9. If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. So that is why the world hates you. So here is Jesus basically flat out saying, look, if you want to be part of the world, then the world's going to absolutely love you. If you want to be part of what he has to say and believe in Jesus, then the world's basically going to hate you. So if I get hate for all this stuff, then man, so be it. I guess that'll be my point on that. Anyways, the point is that criticisms of Jesus were foretold by Jesus himself, and we can see things. The Jesus myth theory is an example of that, criticizing the idea that Jesus even existed in the first place. I mean, once again, it's weird. The Son of God actually telling the future. Who would have thought? Was Jesus crucified? Is there any evidence for this or anything like that? The crucifixion, for what I'm going to talk about here, the Bible accounts for 4 aspects of the crucifixion itself, and specifically comments on these things. If these things actually occurred as the Bible tells us, we should be able to look through history and we should be able to find evidence that these things actually existed as well. These things are the sun failing, the torn veil, an earthquake, and the resurrection. So these are the 4 things that I'm going to talk about. First thing is this, Mark 15, 33 through 34. At noon, darkness came over the whole of the land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. That sounds like something from Star Wars, but I don't speak Greek, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Thank you, New International Version translation, for saving me there. So the idea is that here in this verse, we have the Bible actually making a statement that the sun itself was blotted out from noon until 3. So 3 hours, the sun was blotted out. It's not an eclipse, all right? This is a different thing entirely. The sun's being literally blotted out. Is it possible something like that actually happened? Phlegon of Tralles, He says, end quote, in the fourth year of the 202nd Olympiad, there was a great eclipse of the sun, greater than had ever been known before. For at the 6th hour of the day was changed into night, and the stars were seen in heavens. An earthquake occurred in Bytheria and overthrew a great part of the city of Nicaea. And the 202nd Olympiad was from July AD 29 to June AD 33. That would be in the ballpark of where we would expect the crucifixion of Jesus to happen. As far as the time period, that would be within that time period. And we have a respected historical figure writing down that there was an eclipse, a great eclipse of the sun, greater than had ever been known before. In the Chinese records, what's interesting about the Hebrews and the Chinese is that there are two cultures on the earth that have the longest uninterrupted recording of history. That's the Chinese and that's the Hebrews. We have the Hebrew version of what happened. Well, I guess technically it's not really the Hebrew version, but it's within that sphere, that side of the earth, you know? And then we have the Chinese records. We can go back and look in the Chinese records. If there was a blotting out of the sun, not an eclipse, but the sun stopped shining in the middle of the afternoon for 3 hours, so it got so dark that you could see the stars out, the Chinese most likely would have recorded it because they recorded all sorts of crazy stuff. And here we have within the Chinese record, summer, 4th month, on the day of Renwu, the imperial edict reads, quote, Yin and Yang have mistakenly switched and the sun and moon are eclipsed. The sins of all the people are now on one man. The emperor proclaims pardon under all heavens. This was in the History of the Latter Han Dynasty, Volume 1, Chronicles of Emperor Gangwu, in the 7th year. Here's another quote from the Chinese records. During the reign of the Emperor Gangwu, on the day of Bingying in the 4th month of Jianwu, a halo, a rainbow, encircled the sun. Eclipse of the day of Gihan, man and heaven died. And this is in the History of the Latter Han, Annuals number 18, Gi Hai. All right, so here we have a reference again, specifically of the eclipse that happened, and that the man from heaven died. Gi Hai was the last day of the 3rd month of the spring during the 7th year of the Latter, and so we know that the time that this actually happened, and that was the Han Emperor Kangwu from 6 BC until 57 AD. So we actually get a time period that we can actually take a look at. And if you pinpoint it, you'll find out that that pinpoints to AD 31, exactly 34 years after the comet that was sighted that moved for 70 days. So once again, we're in that ballpark. We're in that time period of what's actually happening, of when people believe that Christ himself was actually crucified. We're zeroing in and we're targeting in on it. There are more sightings regarding the idea of the sun being blotted out. There are references in other letters and things like that, but I think that this kind of just shows you there are historical sources that indicate that the sun was, and it wasn't just an eclipse, that the sun itself actually stopped working for 3 hours. All right, moving on. So the idea of the torn veil, all right, and the torn veil was Matthew 27:51. At the moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. All right, so that's Matthew's account that the temple veil actually got torn. So the temple veil, what is it? Herod's temple. In 1871, a hewn stone was found. In 1936, a fragment of a similar temple inscription was found. And in 1967, archaeologists found that the wall extended all the way around to the Temple Mount. So this is an abridged version of the archaeological history of going from Herod's temple didn't exist to, yes, Herod's temple did exist. Took about 100 years, okay, until they actually found this stuff. For scholars to agree and historians to agree, yes, there really was a Herod's temple. Josephus's records. He indicates that the temple veil was 82.5 feet by 24 feet, so it's a massive, massive curtain. The veil was 4 inches thick, or, quote, 1 handbreadth in thickness. So this is a super, super thick, heavy, heavy, heavy thing. It's not like sheer silk, all right? So the idea that the temple veil was torn in two was a big deal because it was a super, super heavy, super thick thing. It was wrought in 72 squares. The veils were so heavy that they needed 300 priests to manipulate it. When they actually hoisted the veil up into place, they actually had teams of horses to be able to lift it. That's how heavy this thing was when they put it into place. So Matthew 27:51, there's actually another verse, I think, that calls out the fact that an earthquake happened. At the moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, the earth shook and the rocks split. So it's describing an earthquake. If you go to Noah's website and you do a search on it for Israel, Palestine, you look around the right time period, you're going to find that they have recorded information for an earthquake happening around the year 33. There are multiple sources that Noah uses in order to formulate this data. One of them is Robert Mallet, and this is from the year 1853. Another one was John Maline from 1911. Another one was from 1985, and this is from Al-Swani, from Beban and from Isa. And then in 1928 from Willis and from Bailey Willis, and then from 2009 from Nicholas Amberses. Anyways, they recorded a bunch of information regarding people doing core sampling and drilling within the area and comparing the core samples that they took to earthquake activity and then going back and dating it back. There are multiple sources that Noah has used. Noah has taken that information and determined that an earthquake happened in the year 33. So we do have geological evidence that an earthquake actually happened at the time that the Bible said it did. So, all right, moving on to the resurrection. So, I don't know. I thought that one was pretty cool when I found that out. All right, so the resurrection itself hinges on three different concepts. The first one is Jesus' burial. The second one is that his tomb was empty, and the third is resurrection appearances. So we'll kind of cover those real quickly and see, what people have to say or what evidence there is for it and all that kind of stuff. So as far as the burial go, Raymond Brown, he's a New Testament scholar. He says, of Jesus' burial by Joseph, it is very probable, since it is almost inexplicable as to why a Christian would make up a story about a Jewish Sanhedrist who does what is right by Jesus. So it's Joseph of Arimathea. At the burial, John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University on the burial of Jesus in the tomb. His quote is, one of the earliest and best attested to facts about Jesus. As far as the idea of the empty tomb, Jacob Kramer, an Austrian scholar, had said that it is extremely difficult to object to the tomb, to the empty tomb, on historical grounds. Those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. What makes the empty tomb kind of impossible, I guess you could say, would be the way that Romans did stuff. The Romans were incredibly good at killing, and crucifixion itself was an incredibly brutal process. But they were under Roman occupation, under Roman law, and under Roman rule, and it was a military system. So there wasn't willy-nilly. It wasn't like cemeteries were just, if the Romans were told to guard something, it's not like they just did something else. Just about everything within the Roman system itself was on pain of death. So when you look at the history and you look at the type of culture and the type of civilization that the Romans were, and then you look at the claims that the Bible makes regarding Jesus in the empty tomb, you have to, how would I put it? You have to understand the I guess like the amazingness of it or something. I don't know what the words are for this. Look, I'll just read this stuff, okay? So, for example, they had a Roman seal. Clay was affixed to a rope and then stretched across the rock and to the tomb itself. The Roman seal was then pressed into clay. You break the seal and you die. That was the penalty for everything back then, was death. So the tomb itself wasn't just a rock that was in the way, but there was a seal that was actually put into place over it, as well as Roman guard that was actually there. And the Roman guards, there were at least 4 men of highly trained soldiers, experts in torture, combat. They're not frightened of fishermen, and falling asleep or leaving would have resulted in their own execution. The idea that they sat around and got drunk and passed out, that's impossible. That would be like saying there are a bunch of Navy SEALs on a combat mission in another country someplace, and instead of doing the mission, you know what they did instead? They sat around, got drunk, passed out, woke up the next day, and then lied about everything. It wouldn't happen. That's not who soldiers are. That's not who the military is. It's not how these systems are. That's not what happens. Number 3, Jesus's enemies all agreed, and hostile witnesses are some of the best witnesses when it comes to Jesus, his authenticity. Reports by Justin Martyr and Tertullian state that the Jewish leaders explained that the empty tomb the empty tomb as Jesus's disciples stealing his body. Thus, they were acknowledging that the tomb itself was empty. So when you got to keep in mind, Jesus was really well known at the time, and he was doing all this crazy miracle stuff, and he was very popular. And all of a sudden, he's not in the tomb anymore. Everyone knows he should be there. Everyone saw him die. He should be in the tomb. This shouldn't be an issue. He shouldn't have lost the body. There was a seal on the tomb. There were Roman soldiers in the way. There was a massive rock in the way. Where did he go? So the Jewish leaders at the time had to come up with something, because people are freaking out about all of this. He's the Messiah. They're saying he's the Messiah. He raised from the dead. He's like, no, they didn't raise from the dead. His disciples came in and just stole the body away. They had to say something. So the fact that they're even addressing this and saying anything shows in the historical record that the body itself was actually gone and not there, and the people were panicking and freaking out. There are objections to all of this stuff, okay? The idea of Jesus being who he said he was, and that he resurrected, okay? There are objections to this. One of the primary objections is that the disciples all lied. Rudolf Bultmann, New Testament professor at the University of Marburg, he's back in the early 1900s, he had said that all the historical criticism can establish is that the very first disciples came to believe in the resurrection. So he says, flat out, the disciples, they believed that Jesus really did resurrect from the dead. All right. Daniel Brock and Daniel Wallace said, in order to work, the Jesus tomb hypothesis has to claim that the disciples died for something that they knew was a lie. In fact, something that they themselves had fabricated. Further, it has to acknowledge that none of the disciples defected, even when faced with the suffering and the horrible deaths, including stoning and crucifixion. How likely is that? What they're basically saying is, all right, so let's say the disciples got together, they lied, they made the whole thing up, they actually stole the body somehow. They pulled a magic trick, they got him out, and they hid the body from absolutely everybody. These guys' lives were absolutely horrible after that. And not only that, the Bible even specifically accounts for it. After Jesus died, they're all huddling in a room. They're scared out of their minds. They're all trying to figure out what to do. The room's darkened. They're in the center of a darkened room. And then the Bible says that Jesus just appears in front of them, and they all freaked out. They go from being horrified, scared, and going into hiding to going out and preaching and saying out loud that Jesus is resurrected and not being afraid of what happens to him after that. How do you go from there to there? Like, how do you do that? Like, normal people, most people are, I don't want to say make a blanket statement like everybody's afraid of death. Most people want to put it off. You know what I mean? Like, maybe not everybody's afraid of it, or they say they're not afraid of it, but you kind of want it to be all the way at the end, all the way over there. Not today, not right now. And then let alone that, not go do a bunch of stuff that most likely is going to hurry that along, But that's what these guys all did. So like these two scholars are saying, the idea that they would die for a lie, let alone something that they know that they made up, that was a complete lie, underneath pain, underneath torture, none of them broke. How likely is that? We go back to the very first statement. It can be attested to that one thing you can be sure of from the testimony, from history, from all this stuff. These guys truly believed that Jesus resurrected from the dead, and that they saw him and they talked to him and they interacted with him. They truly believed it. You can say whatever you want, whether it actually happened or not. But one thing you can't say these guys didn't believe it. You can't say that. What would have to happen to get a bunch of people that were completely scared out of their wits to all of a sudden go from being completely scared to being completely bold on the same day, out in the open, going out traveling the distance, and then preaching that their buddy came back to life? Like something that, that doesn't happen every day, Luke Johnson, New Testament scholar at Emory University, says some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement that early Christianity was. It went from basically being nothing to taking over absolutely, not everything, but becoming the dominant force, the dominant system, usurping the religions of the day, the Roman and the Greek religious systems of the day, like, transforming people. What happened? Something happened. One of the other criticisms is the idea that they all had a mass hallucination. So they all saw something, but what they saw wasn't what they all said they saw. They all saw something else. Okay, that's kind of the mass hallucination explanation. Mass hysteria is mostly known from incidents where people hysterically believe they have some sort of disease or have some sort of hysterical delusion or false belief. An example of the false belief is I got ants underneath my skin. Okay, and a bunch of people all think they all got ants underneath their skin. Mass hallucination, mass hysteria, in the way that it's understood, the way that it's manifested itself throughout history, recorded incidences of it, doesn't all end up saying, that guy was dead and 3 days later he's alive now. I seen it too. It doesn't manifest itself that way. As far as the mass hallucinations go, Dale Allison, American New Testament scholar, says, I'm sure that the disciples saw Jesus after his death. This is his quote. Typical encounters of the recently deceased do not involve claim or do not issue in claims about an empty tomb, nor do they lead to the founding of a new religion, as they certainly do not typically eat or drink, and they are not seen by crowds of up to 500 people. So that's his quote regarding that. Jesus' resurrection also fulfilled prophecy. Once again, prophecy is his future telling. Jesus fulfilled many prophecies written by different men in many different countries almost 1,000 years in advance. Professor of mathematics Peter Stoner gave 600 students a math problem or probability problem to calculate the odds of one person fulfilling 8 specific prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. And these were all actuaries, basically. They calculated the odds of one person fulfilling all the conditions of one specific prophecy, and then the students did their best to estimate the odds of all the 8 prophecies combined. The students calculated the odds at 1 to the 10 to the 21st, or 1 in 10 to the 21st power. To illustrate that number, Stoner gave the following example, quote, first, blanket the entire Earth land mass with silver dollars 120 feet high. Second, mark one of those silver dollars and randomly bury it. Third, ask a person to travel to Earth and select the marked silver dollar one time, first try, while blindfolded. Biblical scholars tell us that nearly 300 references to 61 specific prophecies of the Messiah were fulfilled by Jesus Christ. One mathematician's estimate of those impossible odds is 1 chance in a trillion. It's a lot of trillions. And I got a picture of what a trillion looks like here. 1 trillion $1 bills. 1 trillion is written was a 1 with 12 zeros. 1 trillion seconds equals 31,546 years. 6 trillion seconds is equivalent to 189,276 years. To put that into a perspective for you of just how big that number is that other guy was talking about in the other slide. So, a list of fulfilled prophecies, a short list that Jesus fulfilled. He would be a descendant of Abraham. He was from the tribe of Judah. He would be a descendant of David. He would come from the stump, i.e. Of Jesse, i.e. after the Davidic kingdom was cut off. He would be born in Bethlehem. He would ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. He would suffer. He would be silent before his accusers, be considered a criminal and executed with them, make intercession for those who really were criminals. He would be killed, have his hands and feet pierced. And what's interesting about this is in Psalm 22:16. This is especially interesting because crucifixion had not yet been practiced when the psalm was written. So there was no way of knowing the reason to pierce anyone's hands or feet. They basically described crucifixion a very, very, very long time before crucifixion even got invented. The people would gamble for his clothing. That was in Psalms 22:18. As a criminal, he would be assigned to a burial place with the wicked and actually end up being buried in a tomb of a wealthy man. That was in Isaiah 53:9. He would not decay. He didn't decay because he resurrected. He got up from the dead. That's in multiple places in Psalms and Isaiah. He would ascend into heaven from where he would one day return to rule the earth. That's in Psalms and that's in Daniel. So Jesus fulfilled many, many more, but these are examples of the prophecies that he did fulfill. So Jesus is unique. He is a unique figure. He is the only one. You know, he was crucified and came back to life. You know, people say stuff like, a lot of the New Age people will say this too. They'll say, well, Jesus never said he was the Messiah. He never said that he was the Son of God. He hinted at it an awful lot. Did he come out and specifically say that? No, he never did. I don't think that's the point. See, one of the standard that the Bible sets for us is that we have to believe. It's not we have to think. It's not you have to be using your reasonable mind. You have to come up and reasonably think that Jesus was who he said he was and that he was the Messiah and he died for your sins. All you got to do is rationalize that. And I'm giving you all the rational stuff. Don't get me wrong. I'm showing you rational argument after rational argument after rational argument. But in the end, you have to choose. You have to believe. And not making a choice is the same thing as making a choice. You have to choose to believe. It's a heart issue. You know, and that's what it really boils down to. That's always the standard, is belief. If God came out and gave you the evidence and said, this is absolutely true, you could still not believe it. But when you believe it, people can show you things, say, well, this can't possibly be true for this reason. Doesn't change the way you believe about something. And like I've said over and over again, give it enough time. Whatever it is they're saying is definitive proof that Jesus isn't who he said he was or something like that, give it 10 years. It'll probably come out, nope, that person was wrong and the Bible was right the entire time. Here's the second point. Jesus didn't have to say he was who he said he was, because at the time that he was actually baptized by John the Baptist, everyone heard God say it. God specifically said, this is my son with whom I'm well pleased, and then a dove came down. Pretty neat, you know? I would have liked to have been there to see it. When you look at the size of the Sea of Galilee, which is where this baptism happened, you realize the thing's bigger than Lake Michigan, like just how massive this absolute thing is. God spoke out loud. The other people around all heard it. So it's not like somebody heard it in their head and that's the only thing. Everyone was looking around going, holy smokes, that's amazing, you know? Jesus didn't have to say it. God said it. God specifically said it. So I don't know why these people are always like, well, Jesus never said, so therefore he's not. It doesn't matter. God said it. You know, and so that's the counter argument for that. People always say that stuff. All right, last bit here. Sholem Asach. I don't know how to pronounce that. He was an early 20th century Jewish writer who actually promoted Christianity, and he wrote, quote, Jesus Christ is to me the outstanding personality of all time, of all history. Everything he has ever said or did has value for us today, and that is something you can say of no other man alive or dead. There is no easy middle ground to stroll upon. You either accept Jesus or you reject him. So I hope I've given you guys enough stuff to think about, at least some things that maybe you didn't know before, something you guys can look up and research for yourself, find out what it is that I'm telling you. It's all true. You can see it all for yourself, and hopefully get you guys started on thinking on the idea, you know, is Jesus who God said he was? All right, not Jesus said he was. Jesus definitely hinted at it. And he used specific language that was from the Old Testament over and over and over again. Definitely hardcore hinting at the fact that he was who Christians claim that he was. I hope this has given you guys enough that you can take a look at it and take an honest look for yourself, because quite frankly, as C.S. Lewis said, man, this is something, there's no middle ground. You have to decide. Okay? You have to choose. And you have to, because if Jesus is exactly who he said he was, then there's nothing is more important than that at all. There's nothing more important. All right. So thank you. What am I supposed to say? Don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications, and I will make another video soon if this worked. Hopefully it did. All right. Bye.